Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Sarah Colhoun, tōku ingoa, no Oti Aho. I'm a research fellow based at the University of Otago in Dunedin, and I'm working on a Marsden-funded research project which is led by Professor Pauline Norris. Pauline is right now zooming in from France, so thanks Pauline. It's quite late in the evening for her. And we're part of a research team that's made up of 5 researchers. Most of us are at the University of Otago and one's the University of Auckland. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So the background to our research project concerns the era that we all find ourselves in, which is the age of big data and of artificial intelligence. So as we know, big data is widely used by researchers and decision makers. So big data comes with so much potential to generate insights and to ultimately improve people's health and their lives. However, big data is only as good as the little pieces of data that make it up. So how accurate are those data? What decisions were those data based on? And how were those decisions to create a particular data point arrived at? And without considering where big data comes from, then we run the risk of exacerbating existing social inequalities. In New Zealand, an example of big data is the IDI, or the Integrated Data Infrastructure, which is the large linked data set housed by Stats New Zealand that contains a huge amount of de-identified data about New Zealanders coming from a range of different sources. And InterRAI data is one of the health data sets that makes up, that contributes to the IDI. But the primary purpose of doing an InterRAI assessment is not to create an InterRAI data set. The primary purpose of doing an InterRAI assessment is to assess older people's needs and to determine their level of care. So the data sets that is created from the needs assessment is a byproduct. And we believe it's important for researchers to understand or who use the InterRAI data set to understand how and why it was produced. Because if InterRAI data is used to make decisions, it can have important implications for people's lives. So this is how the rationale, the kinds of thoughts that form the rationale for our current study, which is called Understanding Big Data. And those ideas that rely on the idea that being able to interpret data appropriately means understanding something about how those data were gathered and under what conditions. So this study, our study, Understanding Big Data, explores how data are gathered in 2 different real-life settings in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So our first case study was in the area of child protection, and we looked at how children were reported to Oranga Tamariki for suspected child abuse. The data point from that case study is a report of concern. We've published some results from that study, but the second that I'm going to talk about today is specifically focused on the InterRAI study, InterRAI. And in both of these case studies, we aim to understand the social context and chain of events that lead to data that then becomes part of the IDI. So our second case study was entirely qualitative. So between Pauline and I, we did 30 interviews with people in 3 different locations of New Zealand, and we observed 15 needs assessments. And for our interviews, we wanted to get 3 main perspectives on how InterRAI assessments happen. So first of all, we wanted to understand from the needs assessors themselves Secondly, we wanted to the perspectives of other professionals who have some role with InterRAI or some understanding of it. And thirdly, we wanted to hear from the clients themselves who've had an InterRAI assessment and or their family members. And so for the needs assessor interviews, we had a range of perspectives within those. So as well as teams of needs assessors who work for Whātu Ora, we also talk to needs assessors who work for healthcare providers in the community, and we talk to those who work in rest homes as well. So a variety of perspectives there. So these are some of our findings so far. These are interim results. We are still finalising these. But our first theme concerns the broader background context in which InterRAI assessments happen. So for these things, we thought about the very broad background, such as the pressures on the health system, COVID-19, and the role of culture in InterRAI assessments. More specifically, the background context was also about how people access an assessment. It was also about the different client situations that result in an assessment and the role that the whānau play in leading up to an InterRAI. So our first key point is about access. How do people get into the InterRAI system? And what are the issues with this? Initially, we found this very confusing. And it became clear that older people primarily access an InterRAI assessment via their GP. But this presents problems because some people do not have a GP, others rarely see their GP, and some others see a different GP each time. And sometimes older people might be reluctant to go and see their GP, or sometimes they might not be able to afford to go. It could be a choice between going to the doctor or doing their grocery shopping. And that was a quote from one of the needs assessor that we talked to. And related to access was the knowledge that's required to seek an InterRAI. So one needs assessor told us that people have no idea what we're talking about when it comes to needs assessments. And family members told us how hard it had been trying to figure out the system and what needs assessment was. And often it seemed that family were relying on friends who'd been through a similar thing with their older parent. So other key points from this broader background context were about the extent of the family involvement in the older person's life. So some families are heavily involved with their older parent, which may trigger an InterRAI. But then again, it may not, because some families said that they still needed to do a lot of prompting to get an assessment to happen. Another key point about this context is that it's an extremely diverse context. So there's a wide variety of client situations. And we observed 15 of these assessments happening, and each one was quite unique. And as I mentioned earlier, there's some wider forces shaping when and how an InterRAI assessment takes place. So perhaps just from this broader background, we may infer that there are some gaps around whose data is missing from the InterRAI dataset because they've not been able to access an assessment. So a quote here, I'll let you read this for yourself, but this is an illustration both of the extent of whānau involvement, but also of the diversity of client situations. So as you can see, this family member was devoted to their mum. They were going over there 3 or 4 times a week. So they had a fairly good, they were very well placed to see what was going on in that situation. And this second quote illustrates how hard it is for people to find out about InterRAI. So no one knows anything about it. And in this case, this person was reliant on friends who'd been through similar experiences. So our second theme is about the process of how needs assessments happen. And this is about how the needs assessor does it, what they do with the information they have, and how they make decisions. And when we were thinking about process, we were interested in things such as how the needs assessor deals with conflicting or inadequate sources of information, and how they then decide which code to put in, and how pragmatic they may be in adapting the InterRAI to fit with constraints, and what combination of tick boxes versus notes that they use, and this just also the skills that the needs assessor brings to the role. So a key point is that needs assessment is a highly skilled role. It depends partly on specific InterRAI training, but also on broader professional training such as nursing or social work, for example, as well as the assessor's personal qualities, their interpersonal skills, their empathy, their experience, both in that role but also professionally, their intuition, and many other factors. They have to carefully unpack all of the information that they're given and use their judgment to decide on the best fit for response options in the InterRAI. Another key point was that assessors often use both key tick boxes and the notes to tell the full story. So sometimes this was when there was conflicting information. So for example, they might enter the code for what the elderly person told them, but then they might write extra things in the notes based on their own observations or what the family member had told them. And another finding was that although the InterRAI is a highly structured questionnaire, often there were pragmatic considerations as to how it was delivered. So a key consideration was time. So it might be adapted to make it shorter, or colloquial language might need to be used, or perhaps some questions were a little too confronting. And so this quote was from a needs assessor who felt that the quality of the InterRAI did depend on who was actually administering it. And different interviewees talked about how they needed to be pragmatic about administering the InterRAI, partly because there were time pressures and they felt it was impossible to follow it to the letter. So this, so you read that. And that same person said that if the InterRAI, is done in a pragmatic way, because if it was done to the letter, you would be in someone's house for 4 hours. And a third theme is about the sources of information that are used to complete an InterRAI. So where information comes from influences what goes into the InterRAI. And there's a range of sources. So firstly, the client themselves, but that might depend on their cognitive ability, their insight, how accepting they are of their situation, and their willingness and ability to communicate. And there may or may not be others present at the assessment. And this can make a huge difference to the information that needs assessors draw on for the assessment, and therefore the codes that they can enter. So beyond who's actually at the assessment, there's also many other sources of information that assessors draw on, and they include their observations around the home, and of the client walking, for example, as well as notes that they may have referred to beforehand or afterwards, in conversations as well. So this quote just illustrates how variable it is as to whether anyone else is at the assessment or not. And then this quote is from a family member, and so it does illustrate the difference that it can make depending on who was at the assessment or not. So, just to sum up, how am I going with time? Okay. Obtaining an InterRAI assessment usually depends on how much the whānau know about services and also on access to services, such as having access to a GP. And the InterRAI data is likely to be affected by who actually attends the assessment in terms of completeness and quality. And needs assessment is a highly skilled job. It needs to be adequately resourced. So these are just a few conclusions to bear in mind when one is using InterRAI data. So just being mindful that how InterRAI data is produced is influenced by a complex social context, which includes various forces in the background. It includes the process in terms of how the data are gathered, and it includes the sources of information that are drawn on to generate the data. And these, we believe these are a few implications that can be drawn from our research. So in terms of policy, we'd love the health system to acknowledge just the absolutely crucial role that needs assessors play in terms of being able to implement that policy goal of ageing in place, and to be able to commit appropriate resources and funding for those amazing teams of needs assessors. We'd also like the health system to consider the information that they currently provide for older clients and their whānau, and look at ways of actually improving that information. In terms of practice, we think perhaps a quality assurance process could include thinking about those tick boxes in the data and considering, are they always an accurate summary of what's going on in the situation? So, considering that the notes also contain a lot of information, but the notes do not, as far as we're aware, do not go into the IDO. And for research, just being mindful of all of these background social context issues. So thank you very much. And just a little disclaimer, I'm not always this nasally, but I spent most of last week in bed, so apologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And set a very high standard, kept your time, and thank you. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. Already.
So I need to press the.
That's on great.
And also Pauline's online, so I might want to chip in at this point with answering questions.
My main question is, did you do the research in one particular area or cover different parts of New Zealand?
Yes, we did it in 3 different locations of New Zealand, and we thought carefully about what those locations were. So 2 were in the South Island and 1 was in the North Island, and they were quite different from each other. Yeah.
Tim, have you got that thingy on your?
Oh, thank you. Karen, I'm Tim from the Ministry of Social Development.
Oh, sorry.
Ministry of Social Development. I work on the elder reviews. I was just thinking about the what you said around data that's in the IDI versus what is not in the IDI. Is the InterRAI data set, does that include all of that qualitative data, the notes that you're talking about, or is some of that lost as well?
Yeah, our understanding is that all of that qualitative data is lost to the IDI. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Sarah. Fantastic presentation, and I love the fact that you highlighted the assessor skill, because it's something in InterRAI we've long recognised. That it's a skill that's very strong. In terms of the note taking, in our education that we deliver to assessors, coding is king. So we very much concentrate on the fact that the coding is the only thing that will come through into any data sources. If there is a conflict around what you're being told, and as there frequently is, particularly when you're assessing people with cognitive loss, then the assessor's skill is in understanding from what the family have told them and the person themselves have told them as to what is the point of truth, and that we try to train them to code the point of truth. And then the notes can collect the fact that there was a disparity between perhaps what the person and the family said, but they should code to what they believe is clinically true. That's our challenge, is in our quality work that we do with ongoing education and support post-competency, is to look for that excellence with our assessors. It's a big task, isn't it?
I'm just curious, when you notice that there's potentially missing data from a sort of your sample, is there any way to triangulate who might be missing by using places where people have to have an assessment? So for instance, people that end up in hospital, is there a difference in is there any way to work out who's actually missing from say the home care assessments by looking at the long-term care assessments or the in-hospital assessments?
That sounds like a great question. I think I'll open it up to the room, but people here are perhaps more qualified to answer that than me.
I think one of the as different ethnic groups are missing as well. So we know in InterRAI there's underrepresentations of Maori, Pacific and Asian. So and what's the reason behind that? It could be access, it could be other reasons as well. All right, thank you, Sarah. Sarah will be here for the rest of the day.